Hey everybody and welcome. Thank you for joining us for our very first installment of our virtual roundtable series by GlocalNet. We're excited to tackle a lot of topics going on in the world. Today we're going to be talking about Asian American discrimination during this COVID crisis, what churches can do, what faith leaders can do about it. So we're going to tackle that. And we have our special guest, Daniel Yang from the Send Institute, along with GlocalNet's Bob Roberts Jr. To tackle this topic. And so they will be here live on our premiere to engage with you today. So if you want to have any questions or you want to discuss the topic, please feel free on Facebook and on YouTube to type up those questions, and they'll be there to answer them during the premiere. Also, please follow us, GlocalNet, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, because we have some additional virtual roundtable series that we'll be releasing in the coming weeks. Actually, our next installment is going to be on preparing your church for post-quarantine world, what that looks like. And we'll have a lot of pastors on that topic as well. So for more information about that, go to glocal.net, follow us on our social media channels, and we look forward to engaging with you and talking to you about those topics. So without further ado, please welcome Daniel Yang and Bob Roberts to talk about this topic on our virtual roundtable series.
Hi, I'm Bob Roberts with the Virtual Roundtable Series, and we are excited that you've joined us today. We're going to talk about Asian American discrimination in the age of COVID-19. It's serious. It's out there. It's for real. And what is it about? Why are the Asians taking a hit on this? And how do we respond to that? What are the implications for that? And I am honored to be joined today by a very good friend and exceptional leader, Daniel Yang. And Daniel works with the Send Institute, with the North American Mission Board, that's based out of Wheaton College, there in the Chicagoland area. Daniel also has been a church planter and a lot of other things along the way. So Daniel, I want to ask you questions that have nothing to do with church planting. Are you ready?
Okay, all right, yeah, let's talk.
Totally
Thanks for having me on, by the way. I'm excited.
I'm glad you're here, man. I'm glad you're here. So here's my question.
Yeah.
How did you come to America? How did you get here?
Yeah, that's a great question. As a matter of fact, actually, I just wrote a chapter in a book on Asian diaspora in the church, and so I got to recount some of that. So I tell it sometimes as a joke. I was conceived in a Thailand refugee camp, born in the cornfields of Illinois. My mom was 6 months pregnant with me when they left Thailand as refugees from Laos originally. And because of the war that happened in Southeast Asia, both Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, my family and the Hmong people in Laos ended up as refugees in Thailand. So we immigrated in 1979, came here to Illinois, but I grew up most of my life in Detroit. So that's kind of my background.
So your Asian background, just a quick statement about what Hmong are. A lot of people hear the word Hmong and they know Vietnam, they know Laos, Thai. What's Hmong?
Yeah, so the Hmong are a stateless ethno-linguistic group, primarily originally from the central highlands of China, eventually came down to the southern province, spilled over into the Southeast Asian countries. My great-grandparents came from China down to Laos. And then obviously, Bob, with the pictures behind you, you know that there are a lot of Hmong people in Vietnam. So that'd be the second largest population. So it'd be China, Vietnam, and then Laos would be the third largest population.
So this is interesting because you were raised with a stateless people that were basically refugees.
Yeah.
Refugees in Thailand. You come to America as refugees. What is that like? Not just you being a refugee, but a whole family history, tribal origins of, I mean, that's got to have some kind of impact on how you see things.
Yeah, absolutely. And then one layer on top of that, you know, when my parents immigrated in 1979, they weren't yet Christians. My dad was about 40. And so they were sponsored by a Lutheran church. And so their whole worldview got flipped upside down eventually when my father became a believer and follower of Jesus. So I think some of the uniquenesses of like the immigrant experience, specifically as a refugee, is you always just process the world kind of like with two sets of eyes. I mean, W.E. Du Bois, he called it like the double consciousness. It's this idea that you're always looking at yourself the way that you look at yourself, but then you're also looking at yourself the way other people look at you. So it's a very unique way to kind of understand, American life and then to process your individual experiences through both lenses.
So
Good
I'm
question.
curious, how do you see home, family, belonging? I mean, I'm just curious. Does that go into your whole worldview and how you think and how you process?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge question. The question of, where is home? It's funny because the first generation may not wrestle with that as much because they know they left their home country. They're not going back. They've made a life in the United States. The second gen, there's almost this kind of pendulum shift where you're asking questions of origin again. Who am I? And so I think, where I've landed over the last 10 years is that, I'm truly an American. There's no question about that. But there's a part of me that knows that there's more to me than just my Americanness. And so what's really resonated over the last few years is to understand much more deeper, what is the kingdom of God? And that transcendent reality actually is really the home that I feel like I'm longing for. That's actually informing how I become a better American and become a better mom. So that's, it sounds cheesy, but the kingdom of God is really the home that personally I'm longing for.
Daniel, when you were saying that, I was thinking, I've known you for many years and you've always been obsessed with the kingdom of God. And I wonder if it's easier for an exile or refugee or a stateless person to possibly grasp the kingdom of God in a pilgrim manner better than any other ethnicity in the world. What do you think?
Well, I think back to how you and I met, Bob, and I was 28 at the time. I was trying to figure out how to start a church that would reach secular atheists and the second gen immigrants. And then I also started working with Jewish and Muslim people. And this is before, I even met you. And I started picking your brain about how do you work with, multi-faith communities. And that's really how our relationship developed. And I think a part of that was I just naturally have always felt comfortable with different kinds of people because, again, you always view yourself through the lens of other people rather than your primary worldview. And so for me, it hasn't been difficult to be in different places. I should say, growing up inner city Detroit, African-American neighborhoods, I think my biggest challenge was actually moving from Detroit to a white suburban, Fort Worth, when I was on staff with you. But that was actually
white people loved you, Daniel. White people just love Daniel.
And some of my best friends are in Texas
Are white
now
people
because of my relationship with you. But I remember sitting down with you. We were having Chinese at Ying's Cafe in North Richland Hills, and you looked at me, and I went through a lot of the things that I just shared, kind of my worldview and my understanding of the world as minority. And you said this, and it was a very powerful thing that changed my life. And I know that you were being prophetic and encouraging and not condescending. You said, you need to stop thinking like a minority. You need to start thinking like a global citizen. And that changed everything for me. So in some ways, I think as an immigrant, refugee, stateless person, thinking like a global citizen is much more natural in some ways.
No pressure, Daniel, but you need to change the world because we need more Hmong theologians that are world renowned. No pressure, just make sure you do that so that
sure. All right,
I can check that box. All right, so the China virus. Have you heard of the China virus?
Yeah, Chinese virus. Yeah, that's what some have called it that.
And it made me sad. I saw something, when I saw it, the first thing that I did was say, no, this is not right. And we need to be careful. And, this is not how we respond. But then it wasn't a day later, I noticed you had actually posted a picture. Somebody had written something harsh and mean, and your brother had seen it, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, yeah. So there was a Hmong family that in Minnesota where, and this is one of thousands of cases that have been documented, where a neighbor left a note, laced with profanity, telling them to go back to China. And obviously they weren't Chinese.
This is your brother.
Well, this is a Hmong family in Minnesota. And then that same day, my brother went to Lowe's and was refused service by one of the workers there. and it was pretty obvious because of him being Asian. And my brother, I mean, he doesn't like report things, but for him to be able to share that story publicly, I think it was very offensive to him. Unfortunately, Bob, the crisis has exacerbated issues that I think Asians have experienced on a day-to-day basis. I don't think there was anything unique necessarily about these incidences. I mean, obviously there was that case in Texas where a family, they were stabbed, and because the person who stabbed them thought they were Chinese and they were bringing the virus to there. Those assaults have been heightened because of the rhetoric around the origins of the virus. But I think the underlying condescending mentality towards Asians it's been there. I mean, sociologists have called Asians like the forever foreigner. It's this idea that you can never be American enough. And I think
why is that, Daniel? Why do you think that is?
I think the United States has a long history of Asian, both Asian discrimination and Asian classification. It goes back to the Chinese, in the late 18th centuries, early 19th centuries. And there were, government campaigns to reduce Chinese workers, obviously in California, working in the gold mines there. Eventually, there was the Asian Immigration Act, which actually, refused more Asians. World War II was huge, right? With the Japanese, the whole idea of the model minority came out of the Japanese being able to recover from World War II and supersede both African Americans and Hispanic communities in terms of becoming middle class. And so I think there's kind of a long history of racializing Asians in a very unique way. And I should say, to preface this conversation, it doesn't make Asians more marginalized than any other group. It doesn't make them, suffer more than any other groups. But it's a nuance to how the United States is racializing people. And so I think there's a long history.
Let me share with you what somebody asked me.
Yeah.
Here's what they said. They said, Bob, you go to Vietnam, you're around Asians all the time, Asian Americans. I mean, they come here, they're smart, they do businesses, they get doctors. What's the big deal, Bob? Why do they get so upset? Because they call it the China virus.
Mm-hmm.
How would you answer someone that? What's the big deal?
Yeah, and that's that. I mean, I've been asked that question directly several times. Two things come to mind. Number one, it actually plays into the racialized history that you and I just talked about. It reinforces that narrative that there are certain kinds of people in the United States that just can't fit in or shouldn't fit in. So it actually increases that resistance to Asians really being considered Americans. And then secondly is it actually stigmatizes Chinese people and someone who's not Chinese. I want to be very careful that, whenever we're talking about something as, sad and grievous as the COVID-19, like I don't want to attribute that to a people group. Now the argument has been, well, we did that with the Spanish flu, we're in a different time. The ideas behind these.
Hey, by the way, you know why they said Spanish flu? You know about that?
Yep. But we wanted to rehash it because I think it's important.
Well, just real quick, it was after World War I. Everyone was fighting. The only people who were not deeply involved in the war and who had the ability to count were the Spanish. That's the only numbers that we have. That's it. Spanish flu. That's why they did it. Had nothing to do with the racial issue. They were the ones who counted it. Go ahead.
That's right. Yeah, and then the way that people perceive that, I know when our administration started calling it that, I know they had political reasons for why they were doing that. But you never know how the grassroots level, least common denominator person takes that and empowers them towards hate or towards stigmatizing people. And so those are the things that I think we just need to be very careful about.
Let me ask you this, Daniel. How does it feel to be a minority in America right now? Forget the China virus. When you look back on the past 5 years,
sure.
How do you feel? You're a minority.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about that?
I would say 80% of the time, it feels great. I love the United States of America. It's my home country. I'm proud to have citizenship here. And so 80% of the time, it feels great. I think there's probably 1 out of 7 days where I'm constantly reminded that I might not fit in, or my son, my wife, somebody that I know. It's the microaggressions. It's the condescending words and phrases that sometimes you just kind of let run off your back like water, but eventually those things pile up. And so, by and large, it's this is home. It's like, how do you feel about your home? It's home. But I do think that as minorities, we have a very unique way of representing, our nation. And I think that's a positive thing, because that's really what makes the United States unique and different compared to a lot of other countries.
How do you think Christians see that?
My understanding of the Bible and of God's people is that it's always been closest to God's heart when it's been on the margins. And so, you see that from the very beginning with God's promises to Abraham. He takes him out of his home, out of what was familiar. And you see that throughout the whole entire Old Testament and into the New Testament and in church history. So I think in some ways as Christians, without thinking of ourselves as being victimized people, we should see the strength in being minorities and marginalized. And then whenever we're in places where we are the majority, that should actually increase our empathy and awareness towards minorities. I think we should be pro-minority as much as possible wherever we're at. That just seems to me like that's the hermeneutic in which God, that we read the scriptures in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you think about the early church, it was the first entity on the face of the earth that was multi-ethnic, intentionally, not by accident, but by commandment. Sometimes I worry, we evangelicals in the States unintentionally can foster these feelings of racism or prejudice. We don't mean to, but we do. We don't understand the hurtful nature of our words. I realized a long time ago in my Baptist tribe, no one would ever say anything disparaging about a non-Anglo pastor. But it was the idea, okay, Hmong, or Vietnamese or Thai or whatever it is, we're going to help you do your own churches. So in that capacity, it's as if, we're the real guys and we're going to make a little space for you to do your thing. I felt like sometimes they were ignored more than they were embraced. You've seemed to be somebody who's been embraced. Do you feel that way or not?
I do. In a lot of spaces, Bob, you've been a huge door opener for me. And so, I think in some ways, and you taught me this, the way to meet with the king is to either one, be introduced, or secondly, sacrifice yourself for his people. And so in a lot of ways, you've introduced me to, white evangelicalism. And I have felt embraced at all levels. It doesn't mean that it's always been comfortable, and I realize that sometimes unintentionally, I can function, or people in my position can function in a token way. And again, that's unintentionally. And so I think in some ways that's a part of learning to be a door opener for other people. And I think that, people have gone out of their way to open and become very uncomfortable doing it, opening doors for me. And so that makes me very glad to do that for others as well. And I also think, and this is something that Steve Warner says about the North American church, he says that immigration is not about the de-Christianization of North America. Immigration is about the de-Europeanization of Christianity. And so in a lot of ways, I realize that what's keeping the evangelical church from steep decline, the way that we've seen in mainline churches, is actually, immigrants and ethnic minorities. So that to me is a God's sovereign thing. It's not a human thing that they've invented. And so I embrace very much both the comforts and the challenges of my role.
Daniel, I honestly believe that minorities from around the world are our best opportunity at spreading the gospel here in America.
Mm.
I really believe that with all of my heart, because you can go to Thailand, you can connect very quickly. We were in Vietnam together, you can connect very quickly. I'm always going to be limited because I'm a white dude from the States, and those barriers don't exist for you. And I think also it's very slow. I'll be the first to admit it. But I think the impact people like you and Dave Gibbons and Francis Chan, and there's a lot of people that are minorities, that are here, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that there's an understanding of the gospel. I've always get nervous when people come from Korea or somewhere and they want to come learn to do church here. I'm going, why? I mean, bring what you experienced there to us. We need that.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me a little bit about uh, evangelism. You work
Mm-hmm.
with Ed Stetzer at the School of Evangelism there. What would you say? How does this impact evangelism, our ability
Mm-hmm.
to share faith? I mean, white people like me who want to share their faith with people of different ethnicities and minorities, how does it impact our ability to do that? What should we know as we
Yeah.
share our faith with minorities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think two things really come to mind when it comes to evangelism. Number one is I think as evangelicals specifically, learning to be in religious pluralistic spaces is something that is necessary for us to be able to do evangelism, specifically, sharing the gospel of salvation, but also kind of the larger message of the gospel of the kingdom. Our ability to be with people that are different from with us is essential in evangelism. And in a lot of ways, because evangelicals have felt like the majority, or at least they've had a level of influence. We've not had to need it to be with other people. So I think in some ways, as a minority person, again, I said this earlier when we first started. It's just always been my worldview to always be with people that believe differently from me. Because I mean, my closest family members are either Buddhist or shamanistic. So that's just my reality. And then secondly is I think we don't realize how collectivistic evangelism was, both in the New Testament, in the early church, and then in people movements around the world. I think I still very much believe in personal conversion, accepting Jesus as your Lord and Savior. But as we've learned from people movements around the world, I mean, when you see entire villages converted to Jesus, it doesn't mean that everybody in that village became a Christian. Just like when Lydia's household was converted, it didn't mean that everybody in her household was converted. It meant that the social fabric of that tribe or that network was changed. That there was an impact to the family structures in society of that particular tribe or village. And that means something. That's beyond just the gospel of individual salvation. It's actually kingdom work. And I think bringing some of that here to North America, especially as Hispanics are an increasing number in North America, and they come from a collectivist background, it teaches us to do evangelism through family structures, social networks, and not just one-on-one all the time.
Hospitality is a bigger thing.
Huge.
Asians I've discovered around the world. I mean, we'll in the States we'll say, yeah, you're my friend. But if a Vietnamese says you're their friend, that's a lot deeper than how we define friendship and hospitality, the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
3 practical things you would say, and if you can just give me 1 or 2, it's okay. 3 is always a good number.
Mm-hmm.
3 things non-Asian Americans can do to affirm Asian Americans right now, whether they're Christians or not, would be what, Daniel? What would you say? Here are 3 things everyone can do to affirm Asian Americans right now.
Yeah, great question. I'll just kind of go in order of complexity. Number 1, you can go to AsianAmericanCollaborative.com or AsianAmericanChristianCollaborative.com. And a statement that some friends put together with some of the data that we talked about earlier about documented.
All right, we'll get that up on the screen.
Yeah.
Chat box.
And then secondly is to continue to have open conversations like this. Again, this isn't unique to COVID-19. COVID-19 exacerbated, some underlying issues that, just like COVID-19 is revealing that, African Americans are disproportionately affected by the disease because of their living conditions, right? We know that that's there. COVID-19 is exposing some of that. So similar in this issue. So having this conversation without reserve, I think is really important. And then thirdly, I think this is probably the most practical thing, is learning to be in friendship and value people that are different from you. I mean, that's the long-term win. Because it doesn't mean that you always have to agree with what they post on Facebook or agree with what they say, but it means that you're in it to make their reality better, and then you're also in it to actually change your own reality. I think that life on life is essential. It doesn't work if you just talk about it. You actually have to live it at your dinner table and in your living rooms. So I think those would be my three.
When I think about you and your work as a missiologist, and you're getting your PhD in that, and I look at missiology, you've always got to look at context. Who are the people? How do they think? What are the broader national and global, and then specific local contexts that the gospel thrives with a particular group of people? When you look at the current context of American life and the racism, I mean, the fear against Muslims, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, Asian American prejudice, African American prejudice. I mean, I don't know, Daniel. I've heard people say this is the most polarized, tense time since the Civil War, where there's all of this tribalism and so forth. Has any of your study, do you see any of that, or is it a fact, or is it merely perceived? Is it real? I'm just curious.
I think the rise of nationalistic tendencies is happening globally. I mean, you see it as you travel around. So it's not unique to North America. You see it in Europe, you see it in Africa, Asia. I mean, the nationalism is, for some reason, it's on the rise. And so we see it in a very unique way here in the United States. But I will say this specifically to evangelicals, and this is me, studying like the way we use anthropology as evangelicals to justify missions, over the last probably century or so, is we did this thing, and we continue to do this thing that I think God is changing mercifully, that we would demonize or exoticize the other so that we could later romanticize how hard it was to reach them. And that was very key to our mission strategy. And I just don't think God is allowing us to do that much more. I think we realize that the closer we get to somebody, you can't exoticize them, you can't demonize them. You have to see them as brother or sister in humanity if you're really going to reach them with the gospel of Jesus. And I think in that way, we're getting closer to this Imago Dei understanding of the world. And so I think that's a very positive thing. And it doesn't mean that God wasn't working, obviously, in the last 100, 200 years of Christian missions. But I think it does mean that our anthropology is actually starting to be updated, and we're realizing that we're depending on old methods of missions.
For what it's worth, Daniel, I'm not a missiologist, but I think you're 1,000% right. Because when I first went to Vietnam, I was scared to death, and these people were this and these people were that, and they weren't. They were human beings. And, we had all this stuff, the government's doing this and that, and some of it was true, some of it was not. But what I discovered was there were reasons for everything they did. You didn't have to agree with those reasons, but generally bad things had happened that had led them to some of the conclusions that they had. And sadly, sometimes we were the reason for those bad things. Daniel, I'm proud of you, man. You're hitting it out of the park. Just keep it up, dude. Keep it up. And keep having children. How many do you have now? 5?
I do have 5, yep.
I had a dream last night that y'all had twins. Tell Linda I saw twins.
Oh, that's great. Well, it definitely wasn't biological then. I can tell you that much.
I love you, buddy. Keep it up, man. Thanks
Bob. I appreciate your leadership, and I appreciate your voice. And I've learned so much from you over the years, and thanks for being a door opener for so many of us.
Send me some Bluebell.
Okay, I'll do that.